I was just going over a basic idea, and this is something that as I've been going through and learning, more and more of these materials and things, get in the habit of repeating things, like listen to the same thing over,
right.
Because they tend to just be full of data. Like there's this huge sort of volumes of information, and being able to hear it like again later, you tend to sort of pull out things that you didn't pay attention to the first time. And there's one seminar that I pulled two of the slides. It's a seminar called Deep Inner Game that I probably, it's 10 hours long, and I've probably listened to it 16 times by now. And it's because it's, you get to know these things, and unlike, as I was discussing before, unlike a skill like driving a car or something like that, just because you know it, it's fairly unlikely that you will remember to use it when it's really helpful. And I was I have weekly writing goals. These are not particularly challenging. I mean, if you lay them down on a sheet of paper, it's like, these are easily accomplished in 5 days, let alone 7 days. And I made it to Friday and I had not done anything. I was like, God, and now I'm going to just like drop the hammer. And I knew that it's so much easier for me if I do it a little bit at a time. I know all these things, but that doesn't mean that here weeks and weeks into this process, I don't pull out my behavior from being 6 years old. I mean, it's weird, but that's part of this challenge.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I think we all do. I think this book is a great example of what you're talking about. It's only like 90 pages, Seneca on the Shortness of Life. Greg gave me a copy of this. It's an awesome book, and it's as short as it is. It's full of every time. I've only read it once, but I get the feeling you've read it more than once. I'm pretty sure you get something out every time you read it.
Absolutely, and I think it's the nature of this type of thing, and I created a slide this time around for just this purpose, which is this is two things. It's a discipline and a philosophy, and that is sort of different than, like, I don't know, learning to teach. I mean, there's just things where you're supposed to learn it and know it, and that is your job. I know it. And this is really, it's a different way of approaching day-to-day life for the most part, and that's just, which makes it remarkably simple and remarkably complex all in the same moment. We're just going to go ahead and get started. Lincoln, if we advance this to 2 more slides. There we go. I always like to start with this question, which is, would you rather be right or successful? This represents 2 totally different mindsets that, if you're in one, which is the being right one, you can never change or succeed, basically. When you're in the concept of being in a successful mindset, or happy or content, out of debt, healthier, it's like, you can plug in a word here, is that if you believe you are 100% right, you are far less likely to test that hypothesis. And so after a while, you're going to tend to get into a headspace where you aren't getting the things that you want, but you're right. So it's an internal mental paradox. And so I really do, as we go through all of these slides that we've got here today, the fundamental notion is that being successful is very different than being right. And in fact, they are almost mutually exclusive, because they are just different ways of viewing the world. And okay, so we'll go to the next slide. Sorry. One other thing that I will note is that I don't read the slides verbatim. They're just here to make sure I don't drift off into madness. And but so I do make these available on the site. And there's plenty of really, really good info in here. So I just want to encourage you to download it and read it. This is just a quick overview. Again, to get started, my name is Greg Gillis, and my background is basically in user experience design, business, process engineering, and before that I was an artist, and so I did a lot of commercial art and a lot of advertising. All of these parts of my background possessed this sort of all of them had methodologies and processes. And over a period of time, I started to realize that they were kind of like exactly the same thing. And then I would go and do other things, like weight training, things like that. And I would see that they have processes that are essentially identical. And so it just sort of drifted me into this space where I wanted to do some research into whether or not there are fundamental or base processes that precede everything else that you can get into. And that's really what this approach is all about. Learning what are, in essence, the universal steps that apply to pretty much every success process. Getting a good understanding of why the steps exist, and then if you go on to work with more mature processes, and the thing that came to my mind the other day, again, we've talked about things like personal finance before. This guy, Rick Edelman, has a great book called The Truth About Money. And when I read it, it just blew my mind because I just had never thought ever about money. Like this, it wasn't something I ever, just you made money and then, you spent it and there you go. And inside of that book, he goes through this drill of saying, like, look, if you want to save money, you have to say how much money you want to save, and then you have to go through all these steps to make this happen. And I started to realize that his approach is the same as the approach I'll be teaching you today, or just talking today. So through today's session, it's really just, I want to give you a clear understanding of what I'm saying when I use the term success, because the language is an important thing. I want to make sure we get through the 5-step process that I'll be discussing, and it sort of underlies everything that I'm discussing. To get sort of a working, hey guys, how's it going? To get a working understanding of common obstacles, and this is something that I can't stress enough, that these obstacles just keep coming up over and over again. And it has very little to do with, anything except being human, that we have approaches to life that tend to make us not want to get through our success processes. And also, at the end of this slide deck, we may not be able to review it today, but there's some online tools that I like a lot, and that I've got like some step-by-step instructions as to how to use them, so hopefully that'll be helpful. But if nothing else, I'd like to instill in you of this belief that no matter what it is that you want to tackle, as long as it's possible, that you can do it. That it's not that the only thing keeping you from it tends to be you. Now, our next slide. Why do I do this? Over a long period of time, just dealing with a lot of people, and as a creator, as a writer, I tend to pay a lot of attention to people just because that's how I get characters and that's how I'm able to sort of make things live on the page. In our culture, in the Western culture in the U.S., we live in a ludicrously abundant and materially verdant sort of environment. And one thing I believe seriously is that the abundance of choice that we enjoy, as well as perfection myths, which are sort of generated by commerce to try and get you to buy things, tends to create this kind of existential doubt and anxiety, that people just have a tendency to be a lot more anxious than I think is super healthy. And what really sort of drives home the problem is this kind of continuous distraction that we get by choice. I mean, we are given choice like every 15 seconds. There's something out there saying, here's a new choice for you to make. And as a result, we get sort of wrapped up in making these minute-to-minute decisions that we sort of move away from longer-term success and fulfillment decisions, things that really would affect sort of our quality of life. And my goal today in presenting this is really just to encourage your personal success. I like this idea of building communities of interest because it's hard. It's hard. It's good to have people that you can talk to about like what you're doing, just so you can noodle through ideas. Because a lot of times people just will look at you blankly and say, like, why would you think about such a thing? Just have another beer. And that is because they don't, it makes people uncomfortable when you're thinking about sort of big things and they just don't want to address that. So building communities of interest is a big deal to me. And then at the very end of this, I really do have this vision of trying to sort of bring these clearly mature processes to more people, and like whether it be through education and primary education. I am not exactly sure which direction I want to go with that. But that it's important to me that why was I 45 before I started to come into contact with materials that have been around since 1919? I mean, it's blew my mind. So that's it. And why are we going with this specific approach? Basically, it's really because these ideas, this five-step process underlies all mature processes. And having worked with people using mature processes, what I notice is they don't understand why the step exists. Like, the step is so complex that just they lose touch with why they're doing it to begin with. In my former business, requirements documentation is a big deal. You need to write these things. And there's a point to writing the requirements document. But people don't really understand it. And so you will get hundreds and hundreds of pages of reasonably well-written words, but they don't do what the document's supposed to do. But the manager who requested it doesn't understand the step. The person doing it doesn't understand the step. And it's only when it comes to the person who needs to use the materials does it become a problem. So that's a big deal to me. And this was one thing that jumped out as I reviewed the slides again. This is a big deal. Understanding why you have a success or a failure is just, it's really important because it's clues. It's clues. When you succeed and when you fail, they aren't, it's not good or bad. It's just like, well, this is working and this isn't working. And so these give you clues as to whether or not you possess any deeper challenges that maybe you haven't even thought of before. And that they don't come to light until you actually start to try and do something very specific. I'm just a process freak, and one of the reasons is that I'm a firm believer in like visual modeling, meaning that it's easier to remember things. A photograph of something gives you a certain amount of information, but like a schematic drawing of it might give you a deeper understanding of it. And so that's why I speak in terms of process, because it gives you, once you get started down the path of something, you always know where you are. Like, it's definitely a roadmap. And so if you find yourself in one part of the process where you haven't really done the preceding steps, you'll know it. You'll have some awareness. Like, well, this is why this is hard, because I didn't really, my plan wasn't very tight, so maybe I need to go back and tighten up my plan. And the other thing is that the process anchors you, and this is something that Lincoln and I are both writing various books right now, and it's a creative process, but it also there's these very material outputs you need to get through in order to say, like, I'm this much further down the path. And on a Monday, I approach it a certain way, and then the next day, all of a sudden, it's like, oh, it's sunny, and then my brain just decides it doesn't want to do that work anymore, and it's like, well, yeah, and so I really always fall back on the fact that I know exactly where I am, and if I'm not doing something, I know what the price I'm going to pay later is, but that doesn't necessarily stop me from being stupid, but at the bare minimum, I know where I'm at. Okay, so we're on the next slide. And the process, this is all I'm talking about. Basically, for anything you do, you think about it and decide what it is, then you figure out how to do it. Then you do it, and then you figure out whether or not you did it very well or not. One thing I noticed recently when I was doing a review of this is for organizations, the problem with this process tends to be here. They tend to want to start here. It makes life easier for them. And with our work through the meetup group with individuals, I'm starting to realize that for people, this little barrier is like a magnetic field. Like, when out here, it's all like, ooh, life's easy and it's mellow. And the closer you get to making a commitment to yourself to do something, the harder it gets. Like, it's psychological. Anxiety starts to bubble up. There's all kinds of things that happen. But that's just something that I think that's just the nature of the beast. I actually spoke to a friend who is in psychotherapy right now, and she mentioned this phenomenon to her therapist, and it was an interesting sort of point of view. The therapist was like, well, forget it. This is clearly what's causing you the anxiety. Like, the fact that there are steps is the thing that's making you anxious. And I personally don't agree with that outlook, but hey, whatever works. I'm about people being able to assess their success. How you do it, seriously, don't care. It's more about anything that can get you past inertia into action is good. And then the other thing in this diagram I was trying to indicate is the fact that you are the thing that sort of drives all of this. That you never escape yourself. There's no getting around it. So all of this sort of sits in this reservoir of you. And so it's very important to be in touch with the person who's doing it. Next slide. The 5 steps that I just showed you, they are inside of all of these mastery processes. It doesn't really matter what kind it is. So if it's exercise, if it's spirituality, if it's project management for large-scale businesses, you will see inside of all of these the 5 steps that I just showed you. The value of these is that once you've made a choice, you say, you know what? I want to retire by the time I'm 55, and I need to know how much money that's going to take, and I am going to make that happen. Then I would say, pick up The Truth About Money and use that mastery process while you understand the 5 steps that you really need to be able to make a decision about what's the outcome you're trying to do. Because these are tried and true things. And I'm not like selling these books. These just happen to be books I've read before. And clearly, no matter what you pick up, that's respected in the universe. It'll possess the 5 steps I just showed you. Okay, go to the next slide. And the last thing before we really kind of get into things is I want to keep these 3 ideas in mind. Success and success-mindedness and the whole idea, I am going to approach success. It's a philosophy. It is not a set of rules that you go through. It's a way to think. It is a theoretical approach to life. It's also a discipline, meaning that there are activities and exercises within it that if you do and repeat them, you'll get better at them. And the last thing, and this is something that I find that I'm having a harder time to express this because I take a fairly intellectual approach to this, but if you don't want to do something, you won't do it. You will find ways to not do it. If you write on a sheet of paper, I am going to save $15, and you don't want to save $15, you're just going to stare at that goal for a long time to come. So I really encourage you as we go through the rest of these slides to be thinking in those terms. Do I want it? This thing that's in my head, do I actually want it, or do I just think I want it? Did somebody tell me I want it? Because it's, in the beginning, everything seems cool, new, and there's novelty attached to it. But once you sort of get into the grind of doing something, like if you're saving for retirement, that's a long-term thing. You need to constantly be aware of why you're doing it. And if you don't have that desire, then strangely, you will find ways to convince yourself. It's like, I'd rather have a pair of shoes. And so that's just, this is the deciding factor almost in every case. Okay, go on to our next slide. This session context slide, I think it's really important for you to realize that I am not trying to convince you of anything. This is stuff that I have come across and I've tested and played with over a long period of time, and I see sort of provable results for myself. And I think that you can do the same as well, but it's really, this is food for thought. And if this starts to fit in with the way you want to do your life, I think it's great. Irrespective of whether or not you find these concepts to be like horrifically bad and you want to reject them, or you find them really appealing, as we go through this process, just keep an open mind. Just knowing this is food for thought. That's all this is. Because there are going to be things that you find that you're going to resonate more or less with you.